Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said that India expects to complete a free trade deal with the European Union by the end of this year. Now, he said this as European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen visited Delhi with a delegation that includes trade negotiators. As the U.S. threatens tariffs against the bloc and India, the EU chief expressed hopes of improving trade relations.
Europe is already India's biggest trading partner. Last year alone, we exchanged 120 billion worth of goods. And over the past 2 decades, our trade has tripled. All this is proof that our businesses and people want to work together. Now we have tasked our teams to build on this momentum and finalize our free trade agreement before the end of the year. We're expecting a lot of our trade negotiators. We told them they should surprise us.
So for more on this, we can speak to our DW Delhi Bureau Chief, Sandra Petersmann, and DW correspondent Anchal Vohra from our studio in Brussels. Anchal, over to you first. We heard von der Leyen there saying, surprise us. What exactly does that mean? What do you think the EU expects from India?
Well, you know, this agreement was first, the EU and India started discussing it back in 2007. So I think when she's saying surprise us to their respective teams, she is admitting that it is an ambitious goal to finalize it by the end of this year. Of course, the EU expects a lot, but really what it's looking at is access to a huge market, to a market of more than 1 billion consumers. But I think there is an understanding now in the EU. There's been a lot of change over the last 2 years, if I may say that. And now there's an understanding in the EU that it may not be everything at the same time, but there may be a sectoral opening. And the EU is now looking at the approach is what can we do with India? And in that sense, they are talking about tech cooperation. They are talking about whether India can reduce EU's dependence on China when it comes to critical supply chains. It's looking at whether India can provide electrical vehicle batteries. That's the new market for EU if it wants to meet its Green Deal goals and replace vehicles here with electric vehicles in time. It wants to see whether India can actually open its markets in a way and lower its automobile tariffs, which is controversial in India. But there's a long list of things here to be achieved. The good news is that there is a shift here in attitudes, and that is that let's see what we can do with India. Let's see whether we can use the technological powerhouse that India has emerged as. Let's see whether we can have an immigrant agreement of sort where we can bring in immigrants from India, skilled workers, but in a controlled manner.
So let's hear also the Indian perspective here and listen to what Prime Minister Narendra Modi had to say.
This is the first comprehensive engagement of the European Union with any single country. We have prepared a blueprint for collaboration in the areas of trade, technology, investment, innovation, green growth, security, skilling, and mobility.
Sandra, unpack this for us, if you will. What does India stand to gain from all this?
Yeah, like Anchal and also the Prime Minister mentioned, India expects better mobility for its skilled people. India has a huge skilled workforce, but a lack of jobs on this side. So obviously, a lot of them seek better opportunities, and Europe is offering these opportunities as an aging society, if I may say. India, a very young country. So mobility, connectivity of people, people-to-people relationship, that is something that was of great emphasis here. And then as well, if both sides can sort out their own tariff issues, then a big market awaits for both of them. India could export more to European countries and vice versa. And also the technical cooperation that comes with technology transfer from Europe to India, which is much wanted here on this side. And we saw a great emphasis today on the emerging technologies, especially artificial intelligence was mentioned as a field where both sides agree that this should be a pillar of the future relationship that both parties seek to build together in the third decade of their strategic relationship, that is. And also security and defense was an issue that was mentioned here. So obviously India is expecting more cooperation there and also more support in the Indo-Pacific, which is of great concern to both sides.
So indeed, no shortage of areas where there could be cooperation. I'm interested in asking about the timing of this, Anchal, because as you've mentioned, this is something that's been talked about for years, and now it looks like a trade deal could be done by the end of the year. What's behind the push?
So there's been a massive change, even if I look at the conversations I was having with EU officials here 2 years ago, they'd say, we don't know what we can do. We don't have enough market access. India's extremely protectionist. The attitude is not just in automobile sector, but also in banking and other areas. But now there's been a sea change. I think about 2 years ago, the EU started to look at how India could become a partner and help the EU reduce its dependence on China, whether these supply chains could be diversified, but did not quite know how to deal with controversial sectors, cooperation in controversial sectors such as agriculture. In India, there are many people involved. A huge percentage of the country is involved in the agricultural sector. So, to liberalize trade there is a difficult call for India. But now there is an understanding in the EU that we've got to go sector-wise. Maybe we delay transition in some sectors. And I think in a large part this has come about just a few months ago, according to our conversations here, and that's because of the threat that the EU feels from one of its closest or the closest ally until recently, the United States. So the threat of tariffs from the US, how that could impact overall earnings in the bloc. I think this is of major concern, and this is kind of in a way, some experts I'm talking to are saying this could be a favor Mr. Trump has granted the EU, because it has pushed EU to resurrect several dormant trade deals, including with India.
Fascinating how that might be affecting global dynamics. Sandra, for the EU and India to find compromise, to get a deal done, which issues do you think will be left to the wayside? What are we not seeing come up in negotiations?
Well, I mean, if you look at today's conversations, they started early in the morning, just concluded over lunch. There was a lot of issues left out. For instance, Russia wasn't really mentioned. The Russia-Ukraine issue, where both don't see, Russia in the same way. For India, it's an all-weather friend. For Europe, it's an aggressor. So the sanctions that the EU has placed against Russia weren't mentioned at all. That is obviously something that both sides will have to deal with. Also, human rights, which were an issue in the past, always mentioned by visitors from the EU. Human rights were not mentioned at all today. Today was really about praise for India, praise for Prime Minister Modi. That was really what was at the center here, and that was the message, I think, well understood from India, that Europe is ready to take its relationship with India to the next level.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. We have been speaking with Sandra Petersmann in Delhi and Anchal Vohra in Brussels.
And with me now is Garima Mohan, who works for the German Marshall Fund and focuses on Europe-India ties in her research. Now, we just heard in our story this growing EU-India relationship can't replace a fall in EU trade with the US. But how much impact could it have?
Well, if this FTA were to come into force, it would be the largest trade deal of its kind in the world. So I think it's a substantial dent both for the EU and India. But in general, as was just mentioned in your report, the EU needs to react to not just increasing tariffs from the US, but also dependencies on China. And to do so, it needs to deepen its economic partnership with India. In addition to the FTA, we also heard Commission President von der Leyen mention economic security in critical sectors where EU seeks to reduce dependencies on China and India seeks to move up the value chain, which open tremendous economic potential for both partners.
Now, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been schmoozing with Donald Trump in Washington. How difficult is the mission to compete for Modi's and India's attention?
I think Europe-India and US-India relationship is fundamentally different. The United States is arguably the most important strategic partner that India has, and the US also plays a critical role in India's difficult and tense relationship with China. With Europe, in fact, India has different motives, and it has been reaching out to European countries for the last decade, really increasing diplomatic engagement with players across the board in Europe, including member states, as well as Brussels. now with the announcement of global tariffs, which the US has announced, which will impact India, uncertainties in US policy towards China, we do not know where President Trump is going with his talk of a deal with Xi Jinping. All of these factors also push India to look towards Europe, just as Europe is looking to diversify its partnerships and looking to India.
Now, do you think, does von der Leyen maybe need to leave some of the famous European values at the door?
Well, Europe now has to be pragmatic. What we heard this morning from von der Leyen was very clearly an interest-based foreign policy. She said, in the era of great power competition, European and Indian interests align. Therefore, I think there is a need to strike a balance between the values that Europe focuses on, as well as its interests in working with diversified partners. And I think the era of pure idealism in foreign policy is over.
Now, India's relationship with Russia is, let's call it nuanced, but even friendly. Can Europe really ignore that in a trade deal with India?
Well, India's position with Russia is nuanced, and India is set to play a positive role in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We've seen senior official level talks between the Indian National Security Advisor and Ukrainian officials and the Russian counterparts. India seeks to play a positive role. India's position is certainly closer to Europe than the United States under President Donald Trump. And therefore, this issue has not really impacted Europe-India ties and will not do so. India is also looking to diversify its security defense partnerships to reduce dependence on Russia. And so I think the signals from both sides are clear, and this has not upended ties in a way that many thought it would.
That was Garima Mohan with the German Marshall Fund. Thank you very much.